Hi there, I'm Lillian. Welcome to my channel. Here I talk about what it's like to wake up inside your own marriage and realize you're living in covert domestic violence. There's a reason your marriage is full of high conflict and you feel alone and isolated and your heart is hurting most of the time. It's that your Prince Charming isn't so charming after all. I found out that the man I married wasn't wounded or dysfunctional like he pretended. Instead, he was a wolf in sheep's clothing that created a horrible marriage and ended up being really dangerous for me. If you think that sounds like something you might be living in, hang on. There's hope in God. He will drive away a wolf by healing your femininity. There's nothing that's too hard for the Lord. There's a few things I'm going to touch on in this video. I want to talk about how, as a woman, when your brain collects information, if you don't embody your femininity, you put yourself at a huge disadvantage in relationships. I'm going to talk about how we women have a sixth sense that's not as woo-woo as it sounds because it's rooted in the biology of our estrogen. God did something really cool with us. He gave us a large capacity of it so that we can easily engage in something called nonverbal communication. And that means we have this innate ability to effortlessly absorb from all 5 of the sensing channels in the brain simultaneously. And I also want to talk about how important it is for masculinity to understand femininity and how that understanding factors in hugely to your experience in the one flesh relationship. If you haven't listened to part 1, you can find it in the playlist called Breadcrumbing is Not Cleaving, and also I'll put a link in the description box. Why is breadcrumbing so hard to see? And why does it happen to so many of us women? One of the reasons is that it's intentionally hidden. If you're married to a wolf in sheep's clothing, it's almost impossible to identify. It's a little easier to see if your husband's wounded and dysfunctional rather than toxic and dangerous. Another reason it's confusing to know if and when you're being breadcrumbed is because you can't see the motive of another person's heart. So we end up trying to analyze what's impossible for us to see and figure out. What I mean is that a woman's at a disadvantage in her marriage when she uses her 5 senses intentionally to gather information. The senses of sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell, they're all linear and at a conscious level. This is the primary operating system for a man because it's direct and linear. That's what makes it single focused, and that's masculine thinking. Our primary operating system is more like that 6th sense. You've heard that saying that women have a 6th sense. We do. It's our feelings and emotions. They're powerful for us because they live in estrogen, and that's our hormone, not testosterone like men who have got a way less capacity for that 6th sense. It's not that they don't have feelings and emotions. Obviously they do, but their experience isn't like ours. It's not as deep or complex when it comes to relationships. It can be, but their high levels of testosterone make it more difficult for them to access their feelings and emotions. When any of our 5 senses receive messages, each of those senses have their own distinct channel inside the brain. So when you hear someone speak, that message can only travel on the channel of hearing, or if you read the words instead of hearing them, then only on the channel of vision. But in contrast to a single pathway for each individual response, when it comes to nonverbal communication, it's actually pretty cool. It involves all 5 channels at the same time. You've heard me say that men are single vision focused, but women exist in diffuse awareness. This is how we do it. Diffuse awareness isn't just another way to say 6th sense. It's really not an extra sense. It's a misnomer, right? It's all of the senses experienced at the same time. So it just seems like it's an extra sense. In the context of relationship, women have more capacity to be able to easily be engaged in that nonverbal communication because it's feelings based. I've got a couple of videos where I talk about the difference between the single vision focus of men and the diffuse awareness that women live in. I'll link them in the description box and put them in the cards for you. My point is that when God created you, He gave you all that estrogen, and if you want your one flesh relationship to be experienced the way He intended it to be, you have to learn to live in your feminine feelings. We think better when we feel first. It's our feelings that we have to learn to identify with. The masculine way of thinking is to analyze first and then allow the feelings to surface. If you watched the Christmas special by Angel Studios, this is captured perfectly when Joseph delivers Jesus. It's an incredible scene. Joseph is taking care of business first. Then, after he saw that Mary was okay, there was this surge of emotions that he couldn't access while he was in protector mode. That's how it always works with the masculine. They do the good action first. Whatever that action is, then the good feelings come as the defenses are lowered. We do the opposite. Feeling first is our primary system of self-identification and self-protection. It's the first step for us women in relationship, is to feel safe. It's not if you think you're safe or if you believe that you're safe. That's masculine thinking because you've already landed on the outcome without taking your feelings into account. It's the order of the process that we have to learn. It's the order of the process that's so important. You need that so you can feel if your husband is actually cleaving to you or if he's breadcrumbing you. In its most basic explanation, breadcrumbs are done for you. It's the opposite of cleaving to you. Remember in part 1 I said to hang on to those words because they factor into this whole series. They're the structure of the concept. Understanding the difference between being cleaved to and having breadcrumbs done for you will help you learn to feel the truth instead of looking for it by using those 5 senses to analyze for truth. Learning to feel and accept those feelings from your inner girl is how you quiet the masculine mindset that wants you to operate with that single-focused thinking. So even though we start with acknowledging a piece of information, it doesn't mean that you analyze it first. You're always going to start with receiving a piece of information, but it's your response to that information that matters. The real wisdom happens when you know how and when to move into feeling your own personal experience, feeling the exchange. The better you know yourself, the more you're healed, the more fluid this movement becomes. I want to encourage you again to try and not look at the man's actions or consider him at all. Resist asking why he did it or why he's doing it or why it's happening to you. There's no solution for your healing by drilling down on what your husband's doing wrong to you. Being able to identify what he needs to heal, change, or fix, it's not going to help your girl heart. She's the one who needs all your attention, not him. All right, I want to start with 1 Peter 3, verse 7. There's so much here for us, and it's pivotal for wives. But first I want to share what used to happen to me every time I used to read one of these sections where God was talking specifically to husbands. I was always so triggered by them because no one ever had an answer for me. So I always landed on the same outcome. Yes, he's supposed to be doing that, but he's not. So now what? And I was always left just hanging in this kind of void of ignorance and unknowing. So I usually ended up believing their interpretation of the scriptures and reverted back to more submission and respect. Because after all of the explaining of my situation, whatever each particular situation was that I was looking for help for, that was the only option as a solution I was only ever offered. And then by the time it got to the end of the marriage, like 30 years down the track, the abuse was so bad because the Council from Christendom had made this verse in God's word so unbearable to me. I couldn't see the solution that I'd been looking at all along. And I'll get to that in a minute. There's a way forward, and I'm so excited to share it with you. It's in the interpretation. There's a completely different takeaway for wives than there is for a husband. God tells a husband to live considerately with his wife, with an intelligent recognition of the marriage relationship. Breadcrumbing is the opposite of living considerately with you. It's the opposite of living with you in an intelligent, understanding way of who God created you to be as a woman. Breadcrumbing is the opposite of the man being thoughtful of your feminine heart, mind, and honoring you for that. When the breadcrumbing happens, it's because when a husband looks at his wife, he doesn't actually see all those internal differences. Instead of actually seeing a female, he sees a smaller, weaker version of a man who happens to be doing the role of a wife. His vision of you doing the role of a wife has completely covered your femininity as a woman. Now, if you were to ask him, you know your wife is still female, right? He would say, yes, of course I know that. Yet, when it comes to cleaving to you and connecting to you, he relates to your needs, desires, and wants as if you're a male. He thinks your wants and needs are the same as his. That's the problem. But it's his problem to solve, not yours. What matters is how you feel. God is telling husbands to know their wives by cleaving to them. The question for you is, do I feel known? Part of the problem with 1 Peter 3 is that word gnosis, and the way it's been translated to English. It does not capture God's intent at all. In fact, they miss it by a mile. Sometimes it's translated to read like, live with your wives in an understanding way as with a weaker partner, or live with your wives with the proper understanding that they're more delicate than you. The translators have made it sound like it's something a husband's got to mentally accept, a condition he's got to agree to live with if he wants to get married. They've made it sound like a passive mental assent, or worse, that femininity is something to be tolerated, when gnosis means the opposite of passive. It means get to work doing, to do investigation about her, be inquiring about her and seeking to know her. When a man gets married, he signs up for a life of sacrifice. Ephesians 5:25. Getting married means he's accepting the responsibility that God put on him to figure out the woman. Gnosis is a science word. You know how God chose the word hupotasso, and everyone wants to apply that to the one flesh relationship, when in reality, it's a word for military structure and order, and it's got nothing to do with friendship, any kind of friendship. The masculine interpretation favors itself when it comes to any verses on marriage, which is normal, by the way. I'm not putting men down because of that. Same thing happened in 1 Peter 3, verse 7. God intentionally chose a science word to send a direct message to men. If you get married, you're going to have to study and learn about her at a biological level. In Genesis 2, when God said it's not good that the man is alone, it wasn't because the man was lonely. So he needed a companion or a buddy to keep him company. And it wasn't because the job of the garden was too much for him, so he needed a helper to pick up the slack for him. The woman was created because the job of the garden wasn't enough. The man needed more work to do, not less. So God created a good thing for a man. Proverbs 18. Every time a man decides to get married, he gets this opportunity to grow his masculinity through sacrifice, the way God intended for all of his sons. A man's masculinity was meant to be a source for the world, and in the case of relationship, God gave him more work, not less. So in relationship, that source becomes a heavier responsibility for him. So now his masculinity is responsible for the world and for the femininity of a specific woman. Marriage increases the weight on masculinity. It doesn't make it less. In order for your husband to be thoughtful and honor your needs, he first has to understand what those needs are. And that means he not only has to understand the differences between men and women, but also who you are, your individual personality as a feminine creature. Gnosis is how a masculine man obeys the command from God to cleave to his wife's femininity. He studies her by examining and observing her, and by demonstrating that curiosity towards her in forward momentum. God gave us clues inside our bodies so we can feel what's right, so we can feel that momentum. But it's our response to the information we feel that's what really matters. That sixth sense isn't so that a wife can point a finger at a husband and say, "You're wrong." That's not how God designed femininity to operate. That's nagging. All men see any kind of correction as criticism, and that's how they feel disrespected. So first, when you tell a man what he's doing wrong, and then tell him how to do it right, that's how we teach children. When you're teaching or coaching or instructing, that's done from the masculine orientation. It's outcome-based. You can't operate from masculinity and embody femininity at the same time. It's humanly impossible. And second, responding to your husband with masculine energy instead of feminine is the definition of emasculation. When you emasculate a man, he's going to act wolf-like. So you won't be able to tell the difference between a difficult husband and a dangerous man. In relationship, God designed women to be responders to what we receive from a man. That's part of the reason he didn't create Eve out of the dirt. He used Adam's rib in order to demonstrate that masculinity is the source for femininity. You respond to the awareness of the information, whatever that information happens to be from the man, the source. Then you decide to receive or reject, depending on what you feel in your emotions. You receive it or reject it, but you never correct it. This part right here is when most of us get tripped up and we move right into the masculine thinking and we start to ask, why did you say that? Or why did you do that? Why are you doing that? Or why didn't you? As a woman, you've got the right information from the source, but the response is wrong. We want to analyze why the man isn't following the instruction. In 1 Peter 3, that's not what we do. Instead, we sit on the other side of it, and you read between the lines, because that's where your feelings and emotions experience the one-flesh relationship. In Ephesians 5:28 through 29, God tells your husband to love you as his own body. Then he told him why he's supposed to do it. Because this is how you love yourself as a man, by loving her as a woman. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hates his own flesh, but provides and cares for it. If you don't feel that kind of love, you can't point it out. Because the only way you can point out when someone's doing something wrong is to judge them or criticize them. As mothers, we tell our children because we have to correct them. It's called mothering. But as a woman in relationship with a grown man, you can't do that. That's emasculation. And you put him at a disadvantage towards you. So what do? You don't talk. You feel. There's the command that comes from God to the man. Love your wife. But on the other side of that command sits the receiver of the command, and that's you, the woman. And although we're told not to judge, God never says don't feel. You might not know why someone is doing something, or in this case, why you're not experiencing that kind of love from your husband, but you do know how your heart feels. With all that estrogen, you have the ability to feel first, then respond. So here's the thing. When your husband isn't cleaving to you, that means there's nothing to feel, because there's nothing coming towards your heart. You can't give anything back because you have nothing to respond with. You can't receive or reject. I don't mean you won't. I mean you can't. It's not possible. A woman is created as the Ezer Neged, positionally in front of the man. She's not under his feet or above him. And please, this is the worst one. She's not beside him either. God chose the word neged to positionally place his feminine creature facing masculinity, squarely and straight on. This way, she can be who she was created to be, a reflection like a mirror. The feminine takes whatever it is she receives in front of her from masculinity and responds to him by reflecting it back on him. As a wife, you do this through your actions and behaviors, not with words that are going to make him feel corrected. That means if you don't feel cleaved to, don't pretend. If all he's giving you is breadcrumbs and they don't feel good, don't consume them and don't pretend they feel good to your heart. When you've examined the reality of how you feel inside your heart and you get honest with God about how you feel, you'll be able to respond authentically. You'll be able to respond exactly the way he himself has set the example for you to follow. Isn't that amazing? There's an example for wives to follow in 1 Peter 3, verse 7. You become the embodiment of the consequence that God has set out for the husband who doesn't love his wife by cleaving to her the way God has commanded him to. God's inviting you to help save the man. Helper means saver, not server. This is a really interesting turn of events for wives. In 1 Peter 3:7, the text reads, "Husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with a weaker partner, showing them honor as co-heirs of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered." Here's the thing though, that word ekopto is used 11 times in other places, and for every other time they've translated it, they didn't use the English word hindered or any variation of hindered, like delayed or slowed or deferred or stalled or stuck, which is what the English translations have done. The translators only see it from a masculine perspective. It blinds them to the truth and gravity of God's intention. Ekopto means something really serious. In those other instances, it's always translated as cut off, cut out, cut away, or cut down. A better translation of God's intention towards a husband would be, your prayers will be cut off, cut down, cut away. We really don't understand just how much God values the femininity he placed inside his daughters. He's telling husbands, if you ignore her heart, I will ignore you. If you don't treat her the way I'm telling you to, I will not listen to anything you say or ask I will cut you down. It's a serious sin against you. If your husband's not cleaving to you, it's a big deal. And it's a sin that's being completely ignored. Every time you hear marriage teaching that tells you to continue in submission and respect, no matter how the man treats you or talks to you, what the church is teaching you is to allow him to continue sinning against you and to absorb it into your body. This is how a wolf in sheep's clothing will use breadcrumbing to trick you, and Christian marriage teaching tells you to let him do it. Breadcrumbing is the opposite of being considered first. It's the opposite of being loved on and cherished, cared for, and provided for. Breadcrumbing is the visible proof and demonstration that masculinity is either oblivious to femininity or he hates it and is actively withholding all of the contribution that's owed to you inside of marriage. Cutting him off is usually a euphemism we hear about women withholding sex. But according to those consequences, that's what God warns the man about, being cut off away from God. He says it's not about sex. It's about experiencing the consequences of not cleaving to his wife. If you're not being cleaved to, you respond the same way the Lord does. You cut away from him. It's called leaning away or leaning back from the relationship. It's your door of escape inside of marriage. You create space and distance between you and the offender. If you want to learn how to create space and distance between yourself and your husband when he sins against you, I have 2 videos that can help you learn how to do that. I'll put them in the cards and in the description box for you. In both of those videos, I talk about how to maintain the balance of still doing all the domestic functions for the role of a wife, like keeping the division of labor intact so the family can still function, but at the same time maintaining your dignity and self-respect by leaning back away from the man when he won't repent so that he can reconcile to be in friendship with you again. The first one is called Healing Your Femininity Part 2, and the other is called How to Walk Away in Marriage Without Leaving. Bye for now, and I'll see you in Part 3. Closing thoughts. First, shh. Don't say a word about this to him. Discovering that your husband's dangerous is a scary place to end up. It's never where you thought you'd be, and it feels like an unreality. But your silence about your awareness of what he really is, that's your safety zone. And always remember, a clueless guy that causes dysfunction and seems difficult, he's not dangerous. But the malignant man is not clueless. He just pretends to be difficult and dysfunctional so that he can hide how dangerous he is.